Hello, I'm Nicholas Henshaw. I'm the Vicar of Groombridge in East Sussex, and this is part of our Lent course here in 2024. It is 2024. We've been going through the Gospels and some of the letters. We've had some special lines on Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, and today, having also recorded something on John's Gospel, we're going to be looking at the book of Revelation. I was slightly resistant to this when this was first suggested, but in the end it actually seems a very fitting end to this series in an important way, especially as this is a book that people get carried away with sometimes in a very unhelpful ways. And I hope this approach, briefly, is useful in us not being afraid of Revelation and actually seeing what it's really saying. So, as requested, we're going to dive into Revelation as part of the last in this series on the New Testament. I'd like to note from the outset that Revelation presents particular problems in reading and interpretation. That's been recognised from the very beginning, as it was the last book to actually make it into the list of 27 books recognised by the Church as the New Testament in 367 AD. That's remained authoritative ever since, sure, but even then there were voices that didn't agree. In the West, right up to the 6th, 7th century, there were people who said this shouldn't be in there. And then the 15th century reformers like Zwingli said, remove it from the New Testament, it doesn't belong there. For me, the best solution is the rather wonderful one of the Orthodox churches of the East, who very much say, no, Revelation is part of the New Testament and must be in the canon, but it must never be read in public worship. I think that's a very interesting and potentially quite helpful approach. There has been a recognition from the beginning that Revelation is a different kind of book. As early as the 2nd century, the Montanists ended up basically becoming heretics because they based far too much on Revelation without a conversation with the rest of the New Testament. And throughout Christian history, there's that sense that Revelation, rather like Ezekiel in the Old, must be handled with care. So some preliminaries. The name of the book. The book is simply named after its first word, as was the case with all books in the Hebrew Bible. In English, that is Revelation, which is a direct translation of the Greek word apocalypse. Now, here's our first stumbling block in terms of interpretation, because when we hear apocalypse, we kind of think the end of the world. And all that has lots of imagery taken from later on in Revelation. But no, that's not what the word means. Apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. It simply means revelation. So all the author is saying is, this was revealed to me by God. He's simply telling us what he's writing is a revelation, something communicated by the Lord. Finally, the book is not and never has been called Revelations, despite the colloquial use of that title in North America. It's absolutely not what it's called. What about the author? One of the problems with authorship in the New Testament, and going right back to the early centuries, is that for some bizarre reason, people decide that if somebody is called the same name as somebody else, they must be the same person. That happens to Mark, for instance. So Mark in Acts must be the same person who's the author of the Gospel. Absolutely no evidence for that. All the Marys get bundled into one when they're very clearly separate individuals. In a similar way in the tradition, it's got assumed that anybody called John must be the same John. Now, this is quite problematic, really. And so the assumption that, for instance, the author of Revelation is the same as the author of the fourth Gospel. I mean, this is utterly implausible. And Revelation makes no such claim at all. I mean, it's really worth noting that. One of the reasons it's utterly implausible is the language. Revelation is written in such terrible Greek that some commentators have suggested this was not written by a native Greek speaker, but somebody who was actually speaking Aramaic or Hebrew, and somehow sort of learnt terrible Greek to write down his revelation. By contrast, of course, the fourth Gospel, John's Gospel, is in really very good Greek. So I think we can discount any connection just on the grounds of language, let alone theology, which also diverges very considerably. Despite pious traditions, and there are loads of those around, there is no evidence at all that the same John wrote Revelation and the Gospel, and the text itself strongly suggests that this is a writer we don't know otherwise. So let's stick with that. What about location? Well, that's easy because John tells us, or rather the author tells us, that he's writing in Patmos. That's a Greek island very close to what today is Turkey, but which in John's time was the Greek-speaking province of Anatolia. That's in the Eastern Roman Empire. That's important for his context. His language suggests that he's under some kind of constraint, maybe in prison. He tells us nothing about the community that he is addressing. So what about date and context? Well, Irenaeus, a fantastic figure of the 2nd century, extraordinary person. He dates Revelation. He's only writing himself relatively soon after it's written, to the reign of the Emperor Domitian around 95 or 96 AD. Traditionally, it's been suggested that John's writing Revelation at a time of persecution. And I'm sure that's true. I'm sure there is persecution going on, and that may be the constraint that the author is under. However, whilst 60, 70 years ago, we still were tempted to say, there was loads of persecution going on everywhere all the time for the early Christians, it's clear now that there's very little evidence for that. Yes, Christians were persecuted, but it was not either widespread nor intense for most periods. Certainly, and we'll come back to this in a moment, there was a major persecution of Christians in Rome under the Emperor Nero, and really horrific it was indeed. But it seems very clear from what we can discern that the Christians were not persecuted for being Christians. They were persecuted for being deviant Jews. In the Roman Empire, any religion more ancient than Rome was fine. That was called a religio licta, an allowed religion. Anything that wasn't was not okay. The state would not allow it. And Christianity was very clearly not a licensed religion, not a legal religion. It was a kind of deviant form of Judaism, so it wasn't okay. So whatever else is going on there, yes, it's persecution, but it may not be for the kind of reasons we might think. What about the relationship between Revelation and early Christian worship? Now, everybody seems to agree that there is one, but which way round was it? Did early Christian worship influence Revelation? Did Revelation influence early Christian worship? The truth is, it's probably both and, isn't it? That there's a symbiotic relationship between these two. And right up to the present, let's note, texts from Revelation are used in the daily prayer of all the mainstream Christian traditions. And that's true particularly of the canticles from Revelation. Now, there's a unique feature here for us to ponder, which I'll try not to witter on about too much, but I think is significant. Revelation is the only book in the Bible where God is referred to as Almighty. The word's used 8 times in the Bible, all of them the book of Revelation, apart from one in Paul where he's quoting from somewhere else. It's clear, I would suggest, that the currency of Almighty in Christian prayer comes not from the Bible, but from its use in Christian worship. That doesn't mean God isn't Almighty, but the Bible doesn't really say that very much, except in Revelation. And language. I don't mean the bad Greek to which we've already referred. I mean the language and imagery. Revelation is full of exotic language and exotic imagery taken directly, in most cases, from the Old Testament. And the author assumes that we know that. He assumes that we understand the texts that he's referring to and that we can interpret them in the context that he's now putting them in. Now, of course, that's true of all New Testament texts to an extent, but to a unique degree in Revelation. Almost every verse of Revelation echoes an Old Testament text. That's particularly from Daniel, Ezekiel, the Psalms and Isaiah, with Ezekiel far and away the most influential. There are whole sections of Ezekiel quoted in the last chapters of the book of Revelation. And what about purpose? Now, in a sense, for me, this is the reason I wanted to do this piece on Revelation, because I think this is where we kind of get hung up in the wrong way. Revelation does not claim to predict the future. Let me say that again. Revelation does not claim to predict the future. Rather, in the manner of an Old Testament prophet, the author is commentating on the present and warning of the consequences of what will happen if we fail to pay attention. Now, this is really important and a source of major understanding down the centuries. The word prophet in Hebrew is navi, and that word means someone who proclaims, who calls, who summons. And of course we see that in the Old Testament. That's what prophets do. That they call, they summon, they proclaim. That's what Isaiah does, and Jeremiah. That's their job. And of course we see Jesus doing that throughout his ministry. But that is not predicting the future, right? That's not predicting the future. There are characters in the Old Testament who do see the future, and in English they're called seers. But the word for that in Hebrew and the job is completely different from that of a prophet. So John is not predicting the future, and he does not claim to. He's commentating on the present and inviting us to pay attention. I do want to labour this point because that misunderstanding has been fatal to so many interpretations of Revelation and to many interpretations of Old Testament prophecy as a whole. We need to note that from the outset, John, the author of Revelation, is intentionally writing in highly symbolic language about real events in his own time and culture, and then inviting us to read them as signs of the times for ourselves today. That, I would suggest in one sentence, is the purpose of the book of Revelation. And why, despite the reservations in the tradition about its place in the New Testament canon, it is an important book for us as we seek to engage with the world as it is in our own day, just as much as it was for John in his time, facing the reality of being a Christian in the Roman Empire. Well, sorry, that's the most important paragraph about Revelation I've written, right? I mean, it may need unpacking, so do ask me to witter on about that. Let's do a quick analysis of Revelation. In the summary that follows, I'm depending heavily on the scholarship, particularly of Adela Collins and the great Raymond Brown, great figures of New Testament theology in the 20th and 21st centuries. The content. In Revelation, John tells us how he received revelatory visions from Christ and describes those visions. Most of them are concerned with the future, but John tells them, as we've noted, in order to interpret the experience of the first readers and to evoke a response to that experience. In describing his visions, he uses traditional images. The result is that the book has two levels of meaning. The traditional images call to mind the old story of the conflict between God and a rebellious beast of chaos. The various versions of this story in Revelation express in vivid and highly concrete language the perennial struggle between order and chaos, between life and death, between good and evil. John uses these traditional images to interpret his situation in the here and now. The bestial, chaotic images are applied to the Roman Empire, its leaders, its friends, and the whole culture related to Rome. The new story, which is the second level of meaning, uses the story of conflict to interpret the relationship between the followers of Jesus and the Roman Empire. The hostility of Rome to Christianity and the way of life that Christians follow is revealed in a renewed rebellion of chaos against order, of creature against creator. All this is difficult because, the language itself is deeply symbolic. The Christ of the letters to the seven churches near the beginning of Revelation is exhorting the readers to remain faithful, especially in the face of hostility from their non-Christian neighbours. Another important theme is the warning not to practice immorality, by which the author means idolatry, worshipping something other than God, and to avoid, as a result, meat sacrifice to pagan idols. These warnings teach that the faithful Christians must often be in a critical relationship with their culture, something that it seems to me is worth our reflection too. In the same way, the woman clothed with the sun in chapter 12, often misinterpreted in so many ways, it is very clearly representing the faithful people of God who will be protected by divine power in situations of adversity. Chapters 13 and 17 allude, as we've noted, to the terrible persecution by Nero of Christians around 64 AD. That's meant as a symbol of political the abuse of God-given authority by a leader. In chapters 17 and 18, Rome is then portrayed as the new Babylon, therefore terribly corrupt. The parallel is because the armies of Rome, like those of Babylon at an earlier date, destroyed Jerusalem and the temple back in 70 AD. Then beginning with the seven seals, there's even a film called The Seven Seals, isn't there? Beginning with the seven seals, the visions focus on the future. But it's the same dynamic. He's talking about now so that we can interpret the future, pay attention to the future. The 5 series of visions begin with the seals and end with the second unnumbered series. It all sounds terribly complicated, but they all have the same plot, so we can actually summarise them very clearly. All the visions, all these very complex visions, often coming out of the previous one, all have the same plot. Persecution, punishment of the nations or judgment, the triumph of God, the Lamb and his followers, or salvation. Wow, that's a summary of most of Revelation. Persecution, punishment of the nations or judgment, the triumph of God, the Lamb and his followers, or salvation. Now, if you could read Revelation through that lens, it'll begin to make sense, or at least it'll begin to make sense in the way the author he intended it to. So by repeating this pattern, Revelation expresses the insight that reality in general and Christian life in particular are characterized by conflict and struggle. A further insight is that death is only a phase that we're going through rather than an end. That's why some of those texts from Revelation are used so readily and beautifully at funerals. The new and the old stories of conflict are reinforced by the example of Jesus. They are models for understanding and coming to terms with powerlessness, suffering and death. Readers are given hope within struggle and challenge to distinguish God's cause from Satan's cause in their everyday life. How do we interpret Revelation? Revelation has always been interpreted in various ways, and the 20th century is no exception. Today, certain kinds of conservative Christians believe the book was written to predict a world war occurring in the Middle East that would involve nuclear weapons and fulfill the prophecy of the Battle of Armageddon. Armageddon in Greek begins with an H, by the way, so even that's different from what we might expect. That's in Revelation 16. The main Christian consensus is that that's not what it's about, but is in fact entirely misleading. And of course is misleading because, as we've established, that's not what prophets do. Prophets don't tell the future, they comment on the present. They don't tell the future, they comment on the present. So the mainstream tradition around Revelation is that the prophecies of Revelation were addressed to the late first century and that most of them were not fulfilled in a literal historical way. As such, as we've noted, prophecy is not primarily a matter of prediction. Rather, John's prophetic role, like the Old Testament prophets, consists in exposing and denouncing idolatry and the abuse of power in his own day. His expression of hope for a new heaven and a new earth, these beautiful final parts of Revelation. I mean, chapters 21 and 22, just absolutely astonishingly beautiful, full of promise. They remind us that the kingdom of God is not a matter of the salvation of the individual or the maintenance of a faithful church. The rule of God encompasses all of creation. Now, that's a strong theme that we've picked up, particularly in Paul's letters in this series and in John's Gospel. This is the salvation of the whole created order. Only when all are faithful and the world order itself is characterized by peace and justice will God's will and work be complete. The readers of Revelation today, I would suggest, are challenged by this precisely to pay attention. Thank you very much for going on this journey with me through Lent. It's been a real delight. I've learned a few things and thought about a lot of other things. And I hope it's been of use to you. It's been very useful having some feedback along the way, and do please continue to do that. There'll be no more videos after these two in terms of this course. There will, during Holy Week itself, be a series of reflections, which I hope will be both on YouTube and on Facebook, reflecting on different characters in the story. And of course, in church, we'll be celebrating morning and evening with different reflections, times of silence, times to meditate on the Passion, part in the great services of Palm Sunday and of Maundy Thursday, the Last Supper, of Good Friday, and of course Easter morning, where we celebrate the promise of new life and the renewal, as Revelation has it, of the whole created order.